Very good question. Very good question. First of all, the first operas I did were really portrait operas. And it's true. The operas were really more about the person than what the person did. In a certain way, I could have, the opera about Gandhi, Satyagraha, I could have done it in a lot of different ways and it still would have been Satyagraha, because it was really a portrait of Gandhi. But I finished with Akhenaten. That was the same thing in a way. I was really interested in another portrait of a person, but and I could have used many different incidents in a way. They weren't so important. I more or less decided, came to the end of that kind of work in a certain way. And the next opera I did was with Bob Wilson, which is called The Civil Wars, which again, if you know Bob Wilson's work, you can say there's a story, but it's totally imaginary if you think that there is. This story, they're really visual and poetic stories that have very little to do with telling stories in the ordinary way. Shortly after that I began the Lessing work. The thing that inspired me to work with Lessing to begin with was that this was a story in which the events happened almost entirely in the mind of the people. In fact, one of the problems we're having now, the opera's finished, and I've been talking with some directors about it. Andre Serban and I have been discussing it. One of the main problems of staging a work like the Doris Lessing opera is that everything happens in the heads of the people that are experiencing. In other words, we're talking about a kind of, let's say, spiritual evolution. That's what is happening in the Making of the Representative. It's a story about a planet which is dying. It's going to be frozen by a new ice age has come to this planet. And the people are facing the prospect of their own death and beginning to try to understand what it means. And the Making of the Representative really is about what is left. What can they leave of themselves after their physical bodies have left? So it's a very metaphysical and philosophical opera. And it's one of the problems we've been having, I've been talking with Andre, is how to stage an opera which has no psychological events in it, which have not normal neither normal action nor normal psychological events. So that the motivations are coming from something much more internal. To tell you the truth, in terms of the staging, I'm not sure that we solved the problem yet, but then again, the opera doesn't premiere for a year and a half. We're taking the direction of relying very much on visual elements. We're working with the designer Eiko Ishioko, with whom I worked on the film Mishima. We're talking about working with a choreographer and extending the opera through movement and through image. One of the big problems of the opera is that people spend a lot of time explaining to each other what they're thinking, which is a very difficult thing to make on a stage. The opera's finished. I've written the music, and Mrs. Lessing has done the libretto and adapted it. But we're about a year and 4 months away from the opening night, and we're just beginning to think about how to solve these problems. So I can't give you more of an answer than that, except that there are new problems for us, and we're not even sure yet what we're going to do. So we'll find out. I used a more or less standard orchestra. It's about 60 instruments in the orchestra pit: strings, winds, brass, a harp. That way it's nothing very unusual. This piece will be performed so far. We expect it to be at the Houston Opera, the Lyon Opera, the English National Opera, another opera company in New York, and another one in Holland. So I chose an orchestra where we wouldn't have great difficulties finding players to play it. In other words, I didn't use special electronics or anything of that kind. The music itself depends much more on thinking in terms of harmonic language than, let's say, Akhenaten or Satyagraha did. Those pieces still were in a time of my work where the rhythmic structure of the music was really the most important part of the musical language. I began working with a representative on finding a way to describe a psychological states for the people. This was a very new problem because that hadn't come up before. And in the end, what I've been doing, have been working with key relationships. In some ways, they're somewhat traditional ways. The thing that isn't traditional about it is that it's new for me. So I'm finding out my own ways of doing it. For example, the cold weather happens usually in a certain key for some reason. One event, one kind of realization happens through the progress of a harmonic sequence that reaches finally a certain kind of harmonic resolution, which takes about 90 minutes to happen, actually. So there's a very long, extended harmonic progression and a way of thinking harmonically, which took over a very long period of time. And that became a reflection of the way the ideas of the opera developed. That's not a very detailed description, but it gives you some idea of what I was thinking about. Well, the idea of additive structure was certainly, I would say, in the foreground of my music up until Einstein on the Beach. Now, with Einstein, I became interested in a completely new set of problems that had to do, let's put it this way, when I finished Einstein, when I finished a piece called Music in 12 Parts, at that point what I did, and working for between 1971 and 74, I had begun working in terms of rhythmic structures from 1965. By 71, I began to think I was ready to almost catalog it in a certain way. Now, Music in 12 Parts is really a compendium, that means a collection, of the rhythmic techniques that I had developed that had to do with rhythmic cycles and an additive process and the two working together. And I decided to put this into a piece in 12 parts. By the time I got to part 11 and 12, I had more or less come to the end of the ideas of that kind, and I began working in a different way. I began thinking of two things. One was cadence, and all of part 12 was about the idea of harmonic cadence. One was and in part 11 I began to think about the idea of modulation. So immediately after Music in 12 Parts, I wrote a piece called Another Look at Harmony, and that was in 4 parts, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Einstein on the Beach actually became the base, was based on that music. And it was a title which was certainly meant to be amusing in a certain way, because it's a kind of what we call a flat-footed title. I mean, it's a title which is more obvious than it need be. But since rhythmic structure had been in the forefront of the music for so long, I was making a point that I was shifting in a certain way. That the rhythmic structure would be now let's say the subtext of the music rather than the text, or rather the background rather than the foreground. I became very concerned with one idea. How would it be possible to take harmonic structure and relate it to rhythmic structure? I thought if I could do that, then I would solve a whole different idea of structure in music. In a way, Einstein on the Beach is the beginning of that study. If you look at the notes for Einstein on the Beach, I remember I wrote those notes a long time ago, but I described about 6 different ways that rhythmic structure and harmonic structure are linked. And that was the very first thing that I began to think about. One, of course, was I continued with the idea of cadence. But then, what I wanted to find was a way that the structural harmony and rhythmic structure could occur at the same time throughout a piece, and that the piece was still working in the idea of process. Central to all these ways of working is the idea that the content of the piece is the process of the piece. In other words, that we didn't separate, I mean a whole generation of composers. I mean people like James Tenney and Phil Niblock and John Gibson and Terry Riley and myself and many, many people were working this way. But, and it was connected to people working in the art world. But the main thing is that we didn't take a theme and then develop it. In other words, you didn't take material and then do something to the material. For us, and I was very aware of this in my own case, the material of the piece was actually the process of the piece itself. In other words, structure and process became structure and content became the same thing. This is an old question, of course, about content and structure, but in this music it was very, very clearly the same. Now, Of course, we're not the first people that did it. Certainly that would be true for, let's say, a fugue would be true. A fugue is structure and content structure. Though even there, the theme can become very important. In this kind of music, very often the musical material was less important than the process. Now, through the period I was working with Einstein on the piece, that was still true. I simply had shifted the attention from simply rhythmic structure to harmonic rhythmic structure. That certainly occupied me for the next 5 years, I would say. Then I began to think again in a different way. When I began to write Ignatin, I think in around 1983 or 84, I began to think about harmonic language in actually a very, very different way. I don't know if I can even begin to talk about that now. But it had to do with perspective in a certain way, with a point of view. And I got involved, let me just say very simply, that I became reinterested. When I say reinterested, it seems that so many of the ideas we have are simply discovering for ourselves ideas that other people have had for hundreds of years. You know, it's very hard to discover something, but it's very interesting to rediscover something, if you know what I mean. For example, we can rediscover melodic writing through Palestrina, for example. I mean, it can be completely new. But what I'm talking about now has to do with what I began to think about polytonality in a very, very different way than I had done it before. I began to think about the ambiguity of polytonality, not the idea that we simply heard two keys at the same time, but that in listening to one piece, we could hear it as being in two keys at the same time. That's not quite the same thing, if you see. In other words, if playing the piano, let's say I play a G major chord in my left hand and an A flat chord in my right hand, I'm playing two chords at the same time. But I began to wonder about writing a piece which, if you could look at it harmonically, it was harmonically ambiguous, and depending on how you looked at it, you heard it as being in a different key at different times. And a lot of Ignatin is written that way. So that occupied me for 2 or 3 years. And then very recently, working with the Doris Lessing material, I began to work with the idea of harmonic sequence. One of the things that interested me, and why what I do very often, I'm interested in the forbidden things. One of the things I notice is that the things that we make taboos about usually are somehow very interesting, that behind that taboo is something interesting. So for example, if we have forbidden ourselves certain ideas for long enough, then those ideas become interesting again. Certainly that was true with the kind of music that my generation began writing in the mid-60s. The idea of tonality was a very rigorous kind that we used, was definitely taboo. And it was so taboo that when we began to do it, it totally shocked everybody, and we more or less discovered a new kind of music. So I've always been interested in taboos. I've always felt that lurking behind that taboo is something worth looking at. And I began to think about, I sometimes wonder, what are the things that I don't allow myself to do? The things that we simply don't do. Cadence was one of them. That's why I began working with cadence. Cadences were things that they're so ordinary and they've been around so long that we not only we stop thinking of them, but we don't even use them anymore. A typical contemporary work simply ended in some kind of abstract, non sequitur way. So I got interested in the idea that the cadence itself became the material. A lot of Einstein is about that. And I began thinking about harmonic sequences in the same way. I just did a piece in the last year called The Descent into the Maelstrom, which in this part of the world people know what a maelstrom is, but it's based on a story by Edgar Allan Poe. And I began thinking about harmonic sequences and imitation, which I had never allowed myself to use because I consider them to be forbidden things. And then once I noticed that they were forbidden, once I noticed I had done it, you see, the most interesting taboos are the unconscious ones, the ones that we don't know that we're doing. The ones that we're aware of, they're not so interesting. But I should amend that when I say that the taboo against imitation and rhythmic sequences and harmonic sequences, the thing that interested me about it was that I hadn't noticed it. It was an unconscious prohibition. So I began to work with that way, and I'm working on those ideas right now. So it's hard to know where that can lead to. It proved very useful in the work with Doris Lessing. I don't know how far long I will go with it. But on the main, I would say that I look out for those things that the things that we unconsciously aren't allowed to do. And it's very, very difficult to do that because it's like trying to catch yourself thinking. The thing is, our normal way of thinking is the hardest thing to see. If we can only discover our own patterns of thinking, then we can maybe think in a new way. So a lot of my musical thinking has to do with this way of thinking. Was that clear? Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting. There was a piece like that, Dance 3. I did a few pieces where the hummies were extremely transparent. I don't think that would be, so that was a period of 1970, 1980. With the harmonic language and work like Powaqqatsi or since then, I don't think you could say that. So that period's over. We don't have to answer the question, therefore. I do, to a point. I have friends, I guess I've made my friends in the music world in a rather, without, let's say, without thinking about where the people are from. I have some friends who do concert music, not many, but I do, and I have a lot of friends who do popular music. I think most of my friends are people who are performers. And so it could be someone like David Byrne, or he's a performer, Laurie Anderson, there's another good friend of mine. But I tend to make friends in the music world with people who share a world that I do. Now that tends not to be concert musicians very much. Certainly not academic musicians, because we have almost nothing in common. I make my living writing music and playing music, and I am very much involved with the technology of the microchip digital technology of today, so that I work in live music. We do live concerts with the equivalent of about 15 synthesizers. So this is actually quite normal for, well, not even normal, it's a little more than normal with pop music, but not at all usual in concert music. But because of that, I find that I have a lot in common with people, that maybe more in common with people who work in that technology than maybe someone like Philip Glass. The kind of electronic music he doesn't interest me very much. It's not about the live music that I'm working in. Generally speaking, I don't pay much that close attention to what pop music is doing, except the friends that I have who'll call me up and send me a record and so forth. And then about once a year, there's a friend who'll call up and say, I've just written a song, and I think there's a cello part here, but I don't know what it is. Could you write it? And I very often do that. I like to do it. I find it amusing to do it. It pleases me to help my friends in that way. And it's a kind of, let's say, like relaxation. So I just, there was a young Irish singer named Pierce Turner who did a bunch of songs, and he got a contract with a company called Baker's Banquet, an English company. And I ended up doing 4 string arrangements for his record. First of all, I like his singing a lot, and I think he's a good, very interesting composer of popular music. When he asked me to help him, I just did it. And it wasn't even, I don't think I even got paid, or if I did, it wasn't much. Or if we got any money, it all went into the session, but it's not even about that. I hope that Pierce becomes very well known, but he might not be. One group I worked with called Polyrock, I did that years ago. They never became very well known, though now I'm told that the record, we did 2 records together, and now I'm told that that record is a collector's item. Actually, I'm playing on those records. Because I didn't, then later, they got their own piano player. He had to learn the parts that I played to play live. So it's, let's say, what would you say, my interest in pop music is a dilettante's interest. You know, it's something that it interests me in a mild way, and because for the fun of it in a way that I can't relax with my own music, I can relax with their music, if I can put it that way. Let's see. I say one thing about popular music is my daughter is 18 and my son is 15, and they don't let me forget about it, let me tell you. Not only, but the interesting thing is that they are also rediscovering the pop music of my generation. You know, there's a new thing among kids, and you may be aware of this, where they're discovering music of The Doors, or of, that happened a few years ago, or The Grateful Dead, things that when I was a young guy was going on. They hear it now as historical music, but they like it. I remember when I was working with Raymond Zarek on a record years ago. Raymond Zarek is the keyboard player for The Doors. And I worked with him. Well, he asked me to work with him on something, and I did. And when we were in the studio, my daughter was about 13 at the time, and she kept coming after school with all her friends. They came down to meet Raymond Zarek. So, but besides that, for example, my son is now very interested in Jimi Hendrix and reggae music. So I'm hearing all that music all over again that I used to hear years ago, but now I hear it through the ears of my children. And some of it's very good. Some of it I don't like so much, but I didn't like it so much then. They also, they're very aware of, so having this music in my house, I think that it's made popular music something which it's certainly part of the physical world I live in. When I come home, because I am home, I'm working, but if I go upstairs to where my children are, I can hear what they're playing. My son is playing the guitar, I can hear what he's playing. I hear what music he's learning and what music he's listening to. So there's another part of it. Seems to be. It's absolutely a quote from the finale of Sibelius' Fifth Symphony. You know, it's interesting. I did that piece, and I called it Flow because, to me, it was an obvious quote from Sibelius. To my great disappointment, I found that no one knew the symphony. Now, I thought everybody knew Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, and because I know the tradition of concert music very well. I discovered that a lot of people, even in my own ensemble, Martin Goldray, who was a PhD, he's a pianist, and he has a PhD from Yale, and he knows a lot about music, and it turned out he didn't know that symphony. So, and then I thought, well, I would call it Flow, and you know, now I have to tell you, I had never been to Finland, and I had no idea what you would see there, but I thought, well, if Sibelius looks out, what does he see? Maybe he sees an ice flow. Maybe he thought, so I thought, well, I'll call it Flow, because maybe, I thought, I tried to imagine what a vision would be that Sibelius, now that's a silly idea of, okay, you're laughing, you don't have to put that on the radio if you don't want to, but the idea of calling it Flow was to associate it with, actually I was associating with Finland, actually. That was the idea. And no one has ever figured out what that damn thing meant. So I guess I didn't make a very good title. I should just have called it Sibelius, and then everyone would have known. In terms of the larger question, I don't think American music is all invented. I think that it's a composite music. A lot of it is African, through the influence of jazz rhythms in our music. But I would say that's true of American music. When we say American music, we have to say North and South America. You know, when I was talking to a friend from South America recently, and he said, he was talking about himself, and he said, well, of course, I'm an American. And I said, and I thought only Americans were North American. I said, American? He said, well, I'm not from Africa. And of course it's from America, because it's the North and South America. And African music had a tremendous impact in both places, in Brazil, and I mean, have you heard the music from that part of the world? I've just been in South America, and so anyway, there's that. Then I took a great interest in the music of India, and I spent a lot of time in India. So generally speaking, American music, and for me personally, has included interest in the great traditions of world music, whether they, now, of which European art music is one of the great traditions of world music, but it's only one. You know, there's in the introduction to his book, A Year from Monday, John Cage says, here's to the day when America becomes just another part of the world, no more, no less. Well, I could say the same thing about European art music. Here's to the day when European music becomes just another part of the world of music, no more and no less. In a way, that's happened already begun to happen in America, and it always did, because of the tremendous influence of Africa. We've always had another tradition in America. And I think it's important to recognize that. So as Americans, and both South and Northern Americans, we've had the choice of traditions in a certain way. We could look to the tradition that includes Edvard Grieg, but we could also look to another tradition which we feel the roots very strongly in. So I would say that from the European point of view, I think it may seem invented, but I would say it's not invented at all. I think we are more in the presence of a composite tradition, of a tradition that is taken up from different places and brought together. And it may be that the assimilation appears as an invention, but I think it's clear that the sources are very traditional and just come from maybe very different places. Okay. The name of the film is North-South, and Godfrey is shooting, Powaqqatsi was all done in America, in North America. In fact, most of it was done in a place in North America called Four Corners, where the state of Colorado and Idaho, Nevada, where they all meet, there's a place. And those beautiful pictures at the beginning are from there. It's done in Four Corners and in a number of cities, San Francisco, New York, St. Louis. I think that's it. So it was actually, it was taken from very few places. Godfrey wanted to take the idea of his film into the Southern Hemisphere. And his idea was to, Godfrey is a very ideologically oriented person and is very interested in the God, if I can't say it, how are the Finns going to say it? Let's say, in the introduction of technology into contemporary life and how that is being affected and the effect it has on our life. You can see that in Powaqqatsi. As you can also see that Godfrey is somewhat concerned about this. He's not sure that it's altogether a good thing. In the same way, in the film about the Southern Hemisphere, it's about the interfacing of the traditional cultures of the Southern Hemisphere with the industrial and contemporary cultures of the Northern Hemisphere. And the movie seems to be about that to a certain point. He asked me to come with him on some of the shooting, and I was with him in South America this summer, and I'll be with him in Africa this winter. I'm not sure what the movie exactly will look like. I've seen a script of it, because it's a visual script talking about the shots. But it probably will include much more overtly, in my case, materials from traditional music. I've used traditional material before, but by the time I get done with it, you can hardly recognize it. For example, though I have used a lot of the influence of Indian rhythmic structure on my music is very much there, but it doesn't sound Indian. I mean, no one thinks it sounds Indian, and even if I take the music to India, they don't think it sounds Indian. But in this case, the music might sound more overtly traditional in that way. I'm looking at instruments from different parts of the world, and I'm thinking about the possibility of creating an orchestra that would include maybe the charanga from Peru, and maybe some drums from South America, and maybe marimbas from Mozambique. But I have to say also that I haven't really begun yet, so I don't know yet. Well, Godfrey's project is the main one. I'm also doing a violin concerto when I get back to New York that I will do this winter. Paul Zakowski wants to play it, and Dennis Russell Davis said he wanted to do the European premiere at Bonn, Germany. We're premiering it in New York in March. After that, I'm going to start the next opera I will do will be based on the work by Poe called The Fall of the House of Usher. I've just begun interested in Poe. As you see, once I began to work with Lessing, now I'm interested in writers. For many, many years, I never worked with writers, and now Lessing, that has changed my way of working. And now I'm thinking about Poe. I did a dance theater piece with Poe in which I took a story of his. It's called The Descendant of the Maelstrom, which did I say that I had worked on? I did. And I'll be playing that tonight. You'll be able to hear it tonight. I took a story of Poe's and I did a musical, it would be very much like a tone poem. I did a musical translation of it, you know. By the way, that was another thing I was interested in. It had been so long since anyone had done a tone poem, I decided it was a good idea to do it. So I did a kind of a tone poem based on the story of Poe, such that if you read the story in real time out loud, it would fit into the time of the music. Exactly, we even worked it out that way. It was done as a dance theater piece. So this is a new work based on a work of his, but this will be more of an operatic work. Bob Wilson and I are starting a new project called the Palace of the Arabian Nights, which is for 89 or 90. In terms of recording, we're beginning to do the recording of Akhenaten in January. I just finished a recording project of 2 dance works, which will be released by CBS, I guess, in the spring, but not in Europe till maybe a year from now. So that's enough for right now.